nonetheless the circumstances of the populations that it conjures into being in our minds. Yes? Okay, very good. The category population, which implies two things, right? It implies a sort of unit, which is the individual human being, and it implies an extent over which you are counting those individual human beings, and it suggests that those two fit together in a way that gives us some kind of insight into other things. The point of the article about household size was to call that into question and suggest that perhaps instead of counting individual people, it would make more sense to count households, because that might actually have a stronger relationship to a variety of environmental metrics that are of interest to us. And yes, that was the point of that reading, precisely to call into question this idea of a population, or population as constituted by simply aggregates of individual people. And that in between individual people and populations, there are all manner of intervening structures and variables that actually have a stronger effect on the impact of those people on resources than their gross numbers have. Now, what we need, if we're going to make sense of Harvey, we're going to have to get a little further into this subject-object relationship. I mean, we can see that in the case of population, looking at the way you look at population, the way you count the population, does have effects. Right? All of these efforts, one of the things detailed in Connolly is the effort to standardize the methods of collecting census data around the world so that all of the different countries' censuses could be compared and amalgamated to produce a single figure called global population or world population that would have a consistency of method underlying it, which it was hoped would ensure that, in fact, the number was accurate, objective. And that partakes of this idea that those objects are just out there and that counting them has no effect on them. Your concern is simply to ensure that you count them in a standard way, which is supposed to ensure objectivity. I mean, one of the big debates that comes up with the census every 10 years is whether the Census Bureau should be allowed to use statistical methods of estimation to arrive at its conclusions rather than simply a head count. And this I mean, it always gets caught up in partisan politics, but there is a kind of notion that the accurate way must somehow be counting every head once. Whereas the statisticians will tell you no. You are going to get a more accurate estimate if you in fact use statistical methods of inference rather than a head count. Because the errors involved in trying to count everyone and only count them once are in fact greater than the errors that would be introduced by employing various kinds of methods that would statistically manipulate your findings to ensure greater accuracy. And this gets very nicely to the question of, is that objective reality out there in a stable way in the form of everybody's individual bodies that we can somehow count? Or is it in fact the creation of accounting methods that whose claim to match some kind of objective reality is subject to all kinds of uncertainties? So Harvey uses Malthus and Ricardo and Marx to illustrate his arguments or to drive this essay forward. Malthus is his target for logical empiricism. Ricardo, he suggests, uses a slightly different metaphysics and approaches this subject through what he calls analytical model building. We've talked a little bit about Ricardo this semester, but we have not gone into very much detail. He was a very wealthy man. He actually, I believe, was disinherited, but then went into finance and became extremely wealthy, despite having been disinherited. So he came from a wealthy background and managed to recover or restore his wealth himself. He was also one of the most famous, he's probably more famous among economists than Adam Smith. And part of it was precisely for this analytical model building that he pioneered. Harvey says Ricardo's method was to abstract a few basic elements and relationships out of a complex reality and to analyze and manipulate these idealized elements and relationships in order to discern the structure of the system under consideration. So rather than starting from empirical truths, the kind that Harvey mentioned a moment ago, he starts from abstractions, which he then uses to build a system and then apply that to reality. And the key abstraction is rational economic man. The idea that individuals act in a rational fashion to pursue their economic self-interest. And that this allows us to go from the individual person, who is obviously what can actually be observed in the world, up to these aggregates of markets, supply and demand, that kind of thing. We can aggregate the behaviors, no matter how varied they may be, of actual individuals into nice models based on a few simple assumptions about how people act. And those assumptions can be held to characterize the group of people, regardless of their individual variations in practice. Ricardo was consequently a normative rather than an empirical or positive thinker. More deeply buried in Ricardo's work, however, is a doctrine of social harmony achieved through economically rational behavior in the marketplace. A set of elements and relationships linked into a logical structure is bound to be internally consistent and to be internally harmonious. So the abstraction that Ricardo uses of rational economic man gets worked up into a system about the way markets work. And supply and demand is a characteristic feature of those markets, and they necessarily arrive at equilibrium because of the nature of the way the system itself has been constructed in his mind. On the flip side, we might look at Malthus and say, well, the logical structure of his argument, his system, necessarily arrives at non-equilibrium, or rather arrives at this state of imbalance between human populations and natural resources, and is therefore prone to or destined to be non-harmonious, disharmonious. And Harvey points out that this would seem to make Malthus rather unpalatable to Ricardo, but in fact, Ricardo was sympathetic to Malthus's argument. Why was that? For all of you who've managed to get through this essay, which is how many of you? Be honest. I see. So okay. Do you remember? No? Okay, I'm looking at her. She's not looking at me. Somebody else who's done the reading. You don't remember? Harvey says Ricardo liked Malthus precisely because Malthus actually seemed to provide a kind of logic, and we actually see it in Smith as well, according to which population was just another supply and demand thing, just another market thing. If you had too many people, the price of labor would go down, and that would dampen population growth until there was a shortage, a relative shortage of people, and demand for their labor goes up, relatively speaking, and wages go up, and population increases as a result. And this suited Ricardo's needs from the perspective of his political economy and the question of population growth, and to that extent he was sympathetic. Otherwise, Harvey points out that Ricardo and Malthus had very different political views. Malthus being very sympathetic to the landed aristocracy and notions of agricultural improvement as the key to future prosperity, whereas Ricardo was more aligned with the interests of the industrial capitalist class and favored reforms that would free up labor, not necessarily focused on agriculture, but instead focused on pushing forward with the Industrial Revolution. Be that as it may, they found common cause in a generally Malthusian perspective. In neither case is the method adequate to the problem, according to Harvey. And this is where he introduces relationality as the proper basis from which to address these questions. And this is perhaps the hardest thing to make sense of, and I want to make sure we make sense of it. He says a thing cannot be understood or even talked about independently of the relations it has with other things. This relational view of the world is fundamentally different from the usual and familiar Aristotelian view, characteristic of logical empiricism or Ricardian-type model building, in which things are thought to have an essence of some sort and are therefore regarded as definable without reference to the relationships they have to other things. How many of you have run into this kind of argument before? Okay, quite a few of you. Anybody have an illustration of this point? This gets to the subject-object distinction. Yeah? Okay, we might use a city as an example. Is a city defined simply by the lines on a map, which officially designates its jurisdiction geographically? Or is it in fact the product of all of the things that interact with that space or move through that space to create what it is as a city? Yeah. Okay, so the example of illness in a body being not simply something that you can identify as present or absent in that body, and that's the end of the story. In fact, illness is produced by all kinds of factors that intersect in that individual, but it's not simply a sort of presence, absence, yes, no kind of thing that's irrespective of those circumstances.
Well, the Copernican revolution shows that space is not an outside element that can be definable by our present point, but instead our observations on space are dependent on how we move within that body.
So space is relational.
Then Kant took that and applied it to the objective subjective argument and said that objects are only definable depending on how we observe them.
Okay.
Which is relational itself.
I wonder what Harvey would have to say about Kant. That's actually taken up in other writings of his rather than this one. I'm still looking for simple examples of relationality. Yeah. Hardin brought that up. I'm sorry. Yeah. Oh, his ethical relativism or contingency.
So like if a man is killing an elephant, like maybe 300 years ago, that wasn't a problem, but today it is.
Okay.
Everything that you think about, like his relationship with needs and like limits in society.
But here we're not even talking about ethical questions yet. We're just talking about epistemological questions, which is to say, how do we know that something? How do we know what something is? Right? How do we make a claim that? How do we define things? Right? Defining them relationally is to suggest that it's not a question. You can't isolate objects and give them some kind of stable being that is independent of the relationships around it, the connections between it. An example that's used by Bertel Ullman in a book on this subject is his own act of sitting there writing his book. He says, the book you're holding in your hands right now cannot be defined or it can't be understood independently of all the relationships that make it possible that it is at all. So you have to think about the act of writing. You have to think about the sort of relationships that have made the book what it is, right? Not just that individual particular book, which has got relationships to trees and pulp mills and factories and distribution networks, but also ideas, language. The idea that one person should sit and write down a whole bunch of words in a particular sequence, and then that sequence should be reproduced many, many, many times, and he should be given a salary for doing this. All of those things are contained in the book itself. To simply say, oh, a book is a bound volume of pages with words on it, is to erase all of those factors, right? If that is an adequate definition of a book, you are actually leaving out a whole bunch of things that make that book what that book is. And that's when you get to these questions about historical specificity, right? A book today means a radically different thing from a book before Gutenberg invented the printing press with movable type, right? Once upon a time, books were extremely rare. There weren't very many of them. They were treated as these incredibly, almost sacred objects, precisely because they concentrated the labor of so many people, and they were so expensive to produce. Today, a book is mass-produced. There are millions of them, right? They're all over the place. And that changes what a book is. Similarly, I mean, what Harvey is suggesting is that this is the way the world should be approached, the way knowledge about the world should be approached, if what you're trying to do is understand these kinds of issues. So you can't just look at a particular kind of contraception and say, this is somehow all we need to think about, right? If we can make the pill cheap enough, if we can distribute enough IUDs, it will solve these problems. As if that technology is independent of all the other circumstances in which it is produced, distributed, used, not used. The single-minded focus on technological solutions and things that we see in Connolly is a classic example of thinking in this kind of thing way, rather than thinking relationally about the larger makeup or constitution of the issue being addressed. Do we need a break? Is this driving you all to distraction? All right, 3-minute break, and then we'll come back. Okay. So Harvey then turns to Marx to contrast Marx with Ricardo and Malthus, and he makes a number of other remarks about relationality and Marx's method. He says structures are not things or actions, and we cannot establish their existence through observation. To define elements relationally means to interpret them in a way external to direct observation. Marx's methodology allows that knowledge and the processes of gaining understanding are internal to society. The question then becomes, what is it that produces ideas, and what is it that these ideas serve to produce? So this is a sort of frontal assault on the notion of objectivity embedded in logical empiricism and analytical model building. I mean, according to the logical empiricism view, there are two kinds of truths. There are logical ones that follow from the logic of arguments, and there are empirical ones that you simply observe. And the goal is to observe them in a way that accurately reflects their objective being. If there's something out there that you can't observe directly, by that model, it doesn't exist. Right? Harvey's suggesting that structures, social structures, are in fact non-observable and yet real. And Harvey goes through Marx's argument for value, right? And suggests that value is one of these objective but immaterial structuring principles in capitalist society. Now, we talked about this when we talked about Marx. I don't know if it remains in the forefront of your minds, but it's an interesting question. Is it true that there are things that are real that can't be observed? The relationships created among people by capitalist production and exchange, Marx suggests, are real but can't be observed. Value can't be observed, but it is real. Anybody does this give you the creeps? Are you going to have nightmares about this? Yeah.
Maybe you're just using currency or something like that to infer what value is, whereas value exists on its own.
Value doesn't exist on its own. You infer it from other things.
Like money or labor or whatnot.
But I think the question is precisely whether you grant it the status of existence even though you can only infer it from other things, right? Do you grant it the status of objective reality without being able to view it as an object? Yeah. Doesn't he call those superstructures? There are places in which Marx talks about superstructures, but we're not actually going to try to unpack that right now, I don't think, because that gets into all kinds of complicated debates about its relationship to the so-called base, right? And that's a long and mostly tedious debate in Marxist theory, I'm afraid. Now, the key point here is precisely that the acts of producing knowledge are themselves internal to the society you're studying. Marx is suggesting, or Harvey is arguing, that ideas don't exist somehow independently of the societies in which they are produced and circulate. That one of the things you have to explain if you're going to try to explain or understand a society is the ideas of that society and where they came from. So a Malthusian argument about population is not simply a theory that you can either agree with or disagree with, prove or disprove. It's also a phenomenon of that society that needs itself to be explained. Why should it be that this theory of population emerged when it did and where it did, and that it has moved and circulated and been so powerful ever since? Who uses it? Who considers it important? Who acts to spread it? All of these things are internal to the construction of knowledge and the construction of that society. They have to be explained rather than being treated as somehow separate, simply true or false, simply knowledge or not. And that's why Harvey's going to touch on questions of Malthus's personal background, Ricardo's personal background. It sounds like perhaps ad hominem arguments, right? Arguing from the person or to the